VLookup on the nth record or a Vnth lookup is possible, and I'm going to show you how to get it done with and without an array formula. So let's get going. Let's start off by explaining this workbook. This workbook is going to contain restaurants, a date, and a comment. The reason for this is there can be multiple comments on different days, even on the same day maybe, and it's going to be all ordered from the latest date up to the most recent date. So we're wanting to get some number, so the nth date for a specific restaurant. So let's get going with that, starting with a VLookup. So the reason we can't do a VLookup is because the VLookup only grabs the first record. So for instance, McDonald's, we do a VLookup. Let's just do this range right here. 3, false. That's going to give us amazing remodel right here, which is only going to be the first comment. If I want to grab the second comment, I need to do something different besides just a straight up VLookup. So I want to do a Vnth lookup, so looking vertically for the nth comment, not the first one. So there are two ways of doing it, multiple ways, but I prefer not having extra columns that you set. You can do extra columns just concatenating a couple of these fields to count how many comments there are. But instead of doing it one of those methods, I'd rather do it in one cell so I don't have to keep on adding more and more columns. So this right here is going to be the array formula. So I'm going to copy this, put it down maybe in this cell right here so we can see the whole thing. There we go. We can see the good part of it. And to get the array formula to work, we do a Ctrl+Shift+Enter. You can see the squiggly brackets around there. I'll get it to work. So what we're doing here is an index. So hopefully everyone's familiar with an index match. Instead of doing a match though, we're going to do an index small. As we look at the small formula, it's noticed right here, there's an if statement inside. So it's going to be looking at the specific field right here, column A. It's going to look at the restaurant. So right now we're looking at this field right here, McDonald's. And if it is equal to that restaurant, it's going to grab the specific row for that field. If it does not have that specific restaurant, then it's going to provide a null. So let's create a formula for that if. Well, this will actually be the row formula. So if this cell equals, I'll just reference here, McDonald's. If it's true, let's do the row of this cell. Actually, it does a couple other things. It does the minimum of the rows in the entire range, and then it adds 1 to it. So the minimum of the rows is going to be 2. So we're just going to do a -2 and then +1. I'll show you what that provides us. We need to do absolute references. Sorry about that. So H1. Okay. So notice that all of these rows are where McDonald's is, and this is going to be ranking these row values. So if I want to get the second value here, it's going to say, okay, what is the second smallest? That's the idea of the small formula. So equals small. We're going to look at this range right here, and we're going to go for the second smallest. Second smallest is going to be a 4. The reason it's not going to include any of these false values, typically a false value is a 0. So the second smallest would be a 0 if it's 0, 0, 0, 0, 0 up until we get the first 2. But in this case, because it's just a false value, it excludes those and it only looks at the actual numbers. So the second smallest is a 4. If you go to the third smallest, it should be a 9. There's the 9 right there. So looking at, fifth smallest, what about if we go past the range of how many comments there are for McDonald's? So let's go 8. Notice for 8 there's an error. So that's what an error is going to do if we get an error on the small formula. Let's go back to a 2. So with this, let's now do an index. So index, we're going to be looking at this array right here, which is going to be the comment. Make that absolute. The row is going to be the second smallest one. And let's go to the column. The column is not going to be anything different. It's going to stay that column. So here is amazing food. This is the comment. So this is what the small formula does combined with an index formula. And remember, if we get to a value with an error, we don't want there to be the actual comment of this is an error. So what I like to do is have an if error and say if this value happens to be an error, let's do something to the effect of there aren't, and then we'll concatenate this value, instances of, and then concatenate the restaurant name. So there aren't 8 instances of McDonald's. So this is what the array formula is going to be doing right here. The only difference is when we do this Ctrl+Shift+Enter, and notice how it's looking at the entire range. It's going to be looking at each individual cell as it passes it and applies all these conditions and figures out what the row is, and it'll do the small after it does all of those calculations on the individual cells. So that's what the Ctrl+Shift+Enter does. Another thing that you'll notice that I did with the array formula is I did not do the entire column of A or the entire column of C. The reason being is when it loops through every single cell, it's going to take quite a bit of time to do that. So to avoid having it take forever to actually do these calculations, that's why I did the specific range A2 all the way through A29. So if you have a specific table, you can just do the column name of the or not the column name, but the column of the table, and that will also work for this instance. Just make sure if you're using this method where you call this specific cells, you're using absolute values. So let's go down to the SumProduct. SumProduct is going to be a bit more tricky. The reason being is we are not going to be using the array formula. So notice here there are no squiggly brackets and the formula still works. Let me get rid of this equal sign. The SumProduct formula, let's dissect that a little bit. Notice here we're still going to use the small function, but you'll see these double hyphens. These double hyphens is going to be doing a criteria that'll give you a 0 or a 1. So right here it's going to be doing a double hyphen for a range and equal to the restaurant. So let's do that right now. For the row formula, this is going to be the hyphen one, so let's make sure we get this correct. So this equals McDonald's, and McDonald's is going to be absolute. Alright, true, false. So that's going to give us a 0 or a 1. A 0 if it's false, a 1 if it's true. And what this is going to do right here, notice after that it multiplies it by the row of whatever that cell is. So we'll say if this is true, then we're going to take the row of this cell. And then we're going to do -2 plus 1, because -2, the minimum row in this column is 2, the range that I'm using, A2 all the way through A29. and then we're going to add 1 just so we can get started having this be the first record. So let's do that. If that's not true, then we're going to do a 0. Oh, sorry. One thing that I did not do, we don't want to make the A2 absolute, we just want it to be absolute for column A. There we go. So notice here we have a bunch of zeros, and then we have a 2 and a 4, 12, 14, 19. The reason we have to have zeros here is because with this double hyphen, a false is a 0. So we're going to still have to use it as a number. Now that's going to change the small formula a little bit. So small, if you're looking at this range and say, no, I want the 8th smallest, that's going to be a 0. So as we get the second smallest, that is also going to be a 0. We want the second smallest to be this 4. So what we need to do is we need to do a count. Let's do a count right here. Count of the zeros. I don't know how to do zeros. How about this? Zeros. Alright, so counting the zeros, we're going to do a count if. So let's do a count if right here. This entire range. And the criteria is not equal to McDonald's. 22. Perfect. So with this comment, instead of having it be only comment 2, we're going to have it be comment 2 plus the 22. So get rid of all the zeros. Once there's counting the 22 zeros, it's going to say, okay, so the 24th is going to be this 23rd smallest, this is 24th smallest. And that's going to be amazing foods. So let's put that all together like this. So notice it's going to be, I'll write a formula right here. We'll just do this from scratch. So SumProduct, we're going to use the small formula. And inside the small, we're going to make that criteria for the rows here. So we need to make sure if this right here equals the restaurant, make that absolute. That's going to give us a 0 or a 1. If that is a 0 or 1, we're going to multiply it by the row of this range right here, make it absolute. Subtract the minimum row of this range, which we know is going to be 2, but it's going to change obviously whatever your rows start on for your tables. Let's make that absolute there. And then you're going to add 1. The reason you add 1 is because you don't want row 2 to be a 0. You want it to start at a 1. If it's a 0, then it's going to equal all these other false values, which is a 0. So let's do that. Alright, let's finish off this small formula. So here we're going to get the nth value. So this one we want the second value. So let's get the second value right here, make it absolute. And then we're going to add the count if of this range right here. Make that absolute. And we want it to not equal, and concatenate the restaurant. So that right there is going to give us whatever our nth value is, that row for it. So that's going to be the sum product. Let's close that off, hit enter. There's the 4, that's exactly what we want. So let's get the index, do the range for the comment, make that absolute, comma, it's going to be row number 4, and that is the end of that formula. It's going to be amazing food. And remember, if we have an error, we want to make a comment for that as well. So if this value is an error, comma, I'm going to say there aren't, concatenate number of instances, then instances of the restaurant. Make that absolute. There we go. So now we go to 8. There aren't 8 instances of McDonald's. And if you like this video, please leave a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and I'll be doing some more of these videos.